Hello, everyone, and welcome to APS Webinars. The title of today's webinar is Physical Review Tutorial for Authors, How to Write a Great Scientific Paper. I'm Farah Dawood, and I'll be a host for today's broadcast. Thank you all so much for joining us. APS Webinars are brought to you as a service of the American Physical Society, connecting you with the expertise of individuals who can offer insight into physics careers, educational programs, and professional development for students, working physicists, and educators. Today's presentation features Dr. Matteo Rini. Dr. Rini will be providing tips for writing a scientific paper and also some thoughts on scientific communication in general. After Dr. Rini finishes the presentation, the remainder of the program will belong to you for our question and answer session. Because of the number of people attending this webinar, we are only accepting text questions. So if you would like to ask a question, please type it into the questions panel located on the right side of your screen. You may submit questions through the questions panel at any time during the webinar, and we will answer all of them at the end. We will do our best to cover all of your questions that you submit, but we want to apologize if we are unable to cover everything. Finally, a link to today's recording will be emailed to you after today's event and will be made available on the webinar homepage. Please allow 5 business days for video upload. And so with that, let's get started. Matteo Rini received a PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Pavia in Italy and a PhD in physics from the Humboldt University of Berlin in Germany. He later worked as a laser physicist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. After 10 years in academic research, he shifted to science communication and policy activities, first joining the Directorate for Climate Action of the European Commission, and then the American Physical Society, where he is now the deputy editor of the online magazine Physics. Dr. Rini has taught many workshops on scientific writing at institutions around the world, and we are very, very excited to have him here today. All right, so with that, Matteo, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, and thank you all for being here. Today we will focus the discussion on something that I feel it's maybe too often neglected in scientific careers, which is writing. As you mentioned, I was a former scientist. I used to do experiments with lasers. But then at some point, I was sort of preoccupied about the way science is communicated to the society and to policymakers. And I decided to work on these issues. And that's what I've been doing for about 10 years now. I am the deputy editor of an online magazine of the American Physical Society, which is called Physics, and you can find it at this website. And I will tell you a little more during my talk, not to advertise it, but because it's relevant to the suggestions that I'm giving about writing. So for the sake of this talk, we will focus on writing papers, but you can take these principles and use them in any kind of writing that you're doing, writing cover letters. Very important type of writing is, of course, writing research proposals, grant proposals, and so on and so forth. Before we start, I'd like to mention that the APS is organizing other webinars, and this one is occurring on July 14th, so next week, and it will talk about quantum memories for photons. So you can find the information here, so you can register for that webinar too if you're interested. So I will start my talks with a main message, with a take-home message. And if you were to go home, after 5 minutes, I think this is the most important thing that I want to tell you, which is this fact that I'm really convinced about, that if you are a scientist, you have to consider yourself a professional writer. As a scientist, you communicate your science, you communicate the importance, the beauty, the impact of your science, mostly through writing, writing papers, writing grant proposals. So this is an intrinsic part of your profession. You have to consider yourself a professional in this field, and you have to act accordingly. And very often I see that scientists are very, willing to go to great lengths to improve their skills, learning new programming languages, learn how to operate new machinery, learn new mathematical tricks, and they're ready to spend a long time and a lot of effort to learn the skills. But more rarely, I see scientists thinking about their writing skills. I'm not advocating for doing classes or workshops necessarily, although they can be very useful. I guess what I'm advocating for is a little bit of shift in the way you think about these things. And if you realize that you have this duty, that you are a professional writer, you are in some sense Nabokov, then you will act accordingly. Every time you write, you will think about how you're doing and you will try to improve it. And if you do this consistently, you will improve constantly and very quickly. And in this talk, I hope I will share some thoughts that will help you doing this. So there are many reasons. I mean, the obvious reason for writing well is that you want to communicate what you're doing. And when I give seminars and workshops, especially to students, the number one reason that people have in mind is to get published. If you write well, your chances of getting a paper accepted are higher, which is probably true. But I think there are many, many reasons to try to write well. And I'd like to mention a couple that I think are sometimes neglected. The first one is getting cited. An important metric of your scientific impact is citations, things like the H factor, for instance, the number of papers that cite yours. And I can definitely say that having analyzed a lot the literature, the most cited papers are papers that are well written. They're papers that, when they get picked up, for instance, by a PhD student trying to enter a new field, they read them, they get the message, they learn something new, they would be more inclined to cite your paper. There is a very, very strong association. And then the second reason that I like to mention is something that really is a very important inside science, and that is to communicate with scientists from other fields. I see that many of the breakthroughs that are happening, and probably many of the breakthroughs that will happen in the future, depend on the interdisciplinary exchange of ideas between different fields of physics and of science in general. I've seen theories for condensed matter being used to describe the early universe. I've seen string theory being applied to design optics that are used to manipulate signals in communication schemes, and so on and so forth. All these exchanges are only possible if your paper are written in a way that they can be accessed by scientists in other fields. So you really have to think about who you want to communicate to with your papers. And then there might be other reasons. Proposals or something that are initially examined by program managers, they need to be written for a very broad audience. You cannot write them in a very technical way. And finally, you might be a very young PhD student. You are not even sure whether you want to stay in physics for the rest of your career. But if you work on your communication skills, written and oral, this will be useful no matter where you go. You go to marketing, you go to any kind of field. Writing well and communicating well will be useful to your career. So before I start giving you my suggestions, so let me tell you a little bit about what I'm doing, because there are two aspects of what I'm doing that sort of justify the comments I'm going to give you and sort of put my experience into context. So I work for this online magazine that's called Physics. So you can find it at physics.aps.org. We have many types of articles in this magazine. We have Q&A, culture, anything related to physics. But the core of what we do is what we call viewpoints. Viewpoints are articles written by scientists, and I'm working alongside them to help them improve this article, to help them make them more accessible. And we pick the best papers that we are publishing, and we ask leaders in the field to write commentaries about these papers. Just to give you an example, this is a viewpoint about the discovery gravitational wave that we published in 2016. This is the viewpoint on one of the latest papers by Stephen Hawking on this information paradox on black holes. So these are really the impactful paper. If you had to collect just the papers covered by viewpoints and calculate their impact factor, it will be on the order of 30 or 40. So it's comparable, to magazines like Science and Nature. So these are really the highest profile paper, the most impactful papers that we're publishing. And we are trying to communicate them through these commentaries to every physicist. So to do this, we need to do two things. We need to find the best science, and we need to communicate it effectively. So finding the best science. If you have questions about this, about how we find those papers, I can give you more details. But one of its component is reading hundreds of papers every week and trying to understand whether they're sufficiently important and whether they can be communicated. So when we analyze a paper, we're always asking 4 questions. The general motivation, why are we doing this research? What's the holy grail? What's the long-term goal? The open questions, more specifically, what are some open needs that this paper is trying to address? And then the key result, what is really new in the specific paper? And finally, the impact. This is very often neglected in papers. What are the implications of this result? It's not enough to say what you found. You want to say why that matters. So a very well-written paper allows you very quickly to answer, maybe just by reading the abstract, to answer these 4 questions. And the second part is communicating that science effectively. And so as part of my job, I have edited hundreds of scientists from all levels, from young postdocs to Nobel Prize winners. And so I work with them. They send me a draft, and I work with them to improve that draft. It's often a challenging process. Most often it's quite smooth, but sometimes there are hiccups. And these are some emails that are received from scientists who are sort of resisting my attempt to edit them. And I think they sort of give you some insights or gave me some insights at least, in the mind of a scientist as he or she is trying to write a paper. And they sort of exemplify the challenges of science writing, especially writing a paper for a scientific audience. The first says, you are simplifying too much, they will think I'm stupid. The second writes, if a scientist does not know what a Lyapunov exponent is, he and you should just go back to school. I'm not going to waste time explaining it. And the third says, you have massacred my text once again. There's no way to explain this without Hamiltonian equations. So I think this reflects some challenges that are intrinsic in writing physics and writing science. And I think these are the main challenges. The first one, probably related to the first commentary, they think I'm stupid. I think this is something that derives from the fact that in our environment, in the academic environment, we are brought up talking to our supervisors, to our competitors, to our colleagues, without thinking too much about the real audience who's really listening to us. So if we are, when you are a young PhD student, you give a seminar, you might have a big audience in your department, but the only person you're focusing on is your supervisor sitting there, and you just want to impress. He's going to judge you, he's going to evaluate you. So you're talking to somebody who already knows. You can use jargon because you're sure that they will understand. You're talking to impress, and you're spending a lot of time communicating the how you did the experiment, how long it took, what were the problems. You're not thinking a lot about communicating the why you did it, and the so what, why it matters. The second comment on Lyapunov exponents probably reflects what I call the curse of knowledge. You spent many years working in your field that and you worked on it so much that you forgot how it was before you learned all those complicated things. So you cannot relate to somebody who doesn't know those things. You cannot remember how you were before learning those things. And so you tend to imagine that everybody knows the same that you do, and that's a mistake, of course. And the third is written by a theorist who cannot see a way to explain things without using equations. And I think this sort of expression of the inability to relate to the audience, and probably all the three comments reflect this. And again, when we think about our audience, we often think in a very narrow way: competitors, supervisors, people really working on that specific problem. This is not the real readership of our papers. That's much broader. So we need to relate to the audience. We need to really have a realistic representation of who they are, and we need to write accordingly. So how do we overcome these challenges? And the rest of my talk will be focused on some ideas and on how you could do this. First, try to write with the reader in mind. Writing is an exercise of empathy. You really need to put yourself in the shoes of who is reading, of who is listening. You really need to analyze who they might be, and then, exercise some empathy and try to write for them. The second point is practice. A lot of people think you're either born a writer or you're not. You either have a talent or not. That's absolutely not true. Effective writing and good communication skills can be learned, and I've seen a lot of people doing this. So it's something that you can change, provided that you put just a little effort every time you do it. And finally, a very important suggestion, especially if you're a young student: read a lot. That's important scientifically. It just broadens your mind. You may get ideas from other fields. But in terms of writing, like a writer of fiction who writes a novel, the good writers are good writers because they've read everything on the planet. So if you want to improve your writing skill, read a lot. And once you bump into a paper that you think it's written well, focus on what they are doing. What do they do? What kind of language do they use? What kind of structure they use? And try to copy it. Try to follow the same principles. An important point that I like to make, I imagine that many of you will not necessarily be native English speakers. One thing that I realize is that there is no correlation between speaking English well and writing well. When I received my first papers working with scientists and editing them, I received papers from the US or the UK, and I felt relaxed. I thought, these people mastered the language. I will not have to work very much. On the other hand, if I was receiving a draft from other countries, like my own country, Italy, I was sort of nervous. I thought, okay, will these people write well? It will require more work from my side. Very quickly, I realized that these feelings had no reasons to be. Writing well, it's not about making mistakes. It's not about grammar. It's about a clear structure. It's about logically expressed thoughts. It's about clear thinking. And my favorite writers, as a matter of fact, are non-native speakers. And you get their articles. One of them, he doesn't even know how to use the article a or the. But I received the paper, and the structure is so logical. It's so well put together. I just have to correct the English a little bit, and that's it. So if you're not a native speaker, this is a word of encouragement for you. You can still write exceptionally well. And on the other hand, if you are an English speaker, that's no excuse. You still have to work on your writing skills and try to improve them. So let me go into the core of my talk. And what I usually do when I have sort of longer workshops and classes, I try to build a structured approach to writing. Typically, it's not always the case. Writing is a very creative process. You may start from different points. But I would say that a good approach involves 3 steps. The first is finding your story. The second is building the structure of your story. And the third is finding the best language for that structure, for that story. And so apply effective writing strategies that allow you to write in an accessible and clear way. So let me start with the first point, finding your story. And I'm very convinced that writing is storytelling. A lot of scientists sort of get scared when I say this. They say, you know, we're not writing fiction, really. It's not a story. But let me explain it a little bit. Um, and by storytelling, I want to contrast it, especially with presenting data. And a lot of papers just do that. They tell people what they have done. They present the experiments, they present the results, and that's it. But a story is much more than that. Story implies the context, what motivated your experiments, what open questions caused you, trigger you to do these experiments. And then you go on to explain what you did, and finally you have to talk about the implications of your results. So the story is that sort of broad context and implications presentation that includes all these aspects. And of course, it includes, you know, the core of the story is the new bit, the one thing that makes your paper worth publishing. So having a story in mind is really helpful when you write a paper, especially because telling a story is more than presenting results. So if you have your story in mind, you can also select the results and the experiments that are needed to tell your story. You don't need to talk about all the thousands of experiments you did. Just focus on the ones that are needed to tell the story. And let me give you an example just to illustrate this point, presenting data versus storytelling. This is an image from the paper of Rosalind Franklin. Basically, this is the image that allowed people to understand that DNA has a helical structure. This is an X-ray experiment. So her paper is essentially focused on the data. She does suggest that DNA has a helical structure based on this data, but the paper presents the data, presents this X-ray pattern. Now, the paper which told the story is the paper by Watson and Crick. And that's how it starts. But we should suggest the structure for DNA. So the paper is focused not on the data, but on the story that's behind the data. So probably this can have contributed to the fact that Watson and Crick won the Nobel Prize. Rosalind Frank didn't. There are other reasons too. Obviously, it was unfortunately a different environment back then in terms of gender issues. That might be a part. She also died before getting the Nobel Prize. Although back then, Nobel Prize in principle could have been given to people who were not alive. So I'm not just you know, this is just an example to illustrate this concept of telling a story, of focusing on the story behind the data rather than on the data. And one other thing that I'm really convinced of is that every paper should tell not more than one story. And this is a mistake that I often found in cover letters sent to the editors saying, you've got to publish my paper because of A, B, C, D, E, F. There are tens of stories, tens of reasons why you think your paper is so nice and worth publishing. But I think the important thing is that each paper should focus on one story. What is the one element that the world deserves to know? What is that one story that makes it different from anything else? So if you go through a list of motivations, of reasons for publishing your paper, and none of them individually is sufficient to publish the paper, the editor will not publish it. So when you write a cover letter, focus on the main story that you're going to tell. All the other details don't really matter. You can mention them in a line or so. Maybe they add a little bit of value. But again, if your paper doesn't tell one coherent story, it probably won't be published. Focus on one story, and if you find that you have 2 or 3 stories to tell, you probably should write 2 or 3 papers. And your story should be something that you could summarize in 1 or 2 sentences. These are some summaries of some of the papers that we highlighted. So this is something that you should have in mind. So before even starting to write, brainstorm about what that story can be. And very surprisingly, talking to scientists, I feel that they start the writing and they don't have that very clear in their minds. If you do that before starting the write process, your writing will be much easier and will deliver a much more coherent result. Take a look at this summaries. Let's just read one. A good memory for light. A solid-state optical memory stores a light pulse and even a full image for more than 1 minute, the longest light storage time reported in any system today. So you see, this is the one bit. It's a very clear story summary. If you have a summary like this, short and clear and concise, the cover letter is a very good place where to use it. You talk to an editor, you say, this is the story that I'm going to tell you. Once you have your story in mind, build a story structure and try to devise the elements that you need to tell this story. And I think this is probably the single most important thing, especially for beginner researchers, that they can do to improve the quality of their writing, is to structure your paper. Write an outline for your paper. Use a logic flow diagram that clearly outlines the main sections of your paper. And within those sections, subsections, down to the level of paragraphs. We'll talk a little bit later about paragraphs. The paragraphs are sort of the atomic unit of thought of the logical flow of your paper. So each paragraph should have a title, and in this outline, you should read the titles one after the other and think if they make a coherent logical argument. There are different possibilities for the structure of a scientific paper, but I would say this is by far the most common one. It would work for most journals. Some journals are slightly different. Science is one example, but this works for most cases. So your paper should contain 4 sections: the context, so the broad why, the holy grail, why you're doing this research, what is in the long term that you're trying to achieve. And then you go to more specific research needs, more specific why. So I want to discover dark matter. The research need might be a detector that's sensitive to a particular energy range of the particles, for instance. And then you talk about what you did, so how you address those research needs and those open questions. And finally, as I said, the 4th point, the implications. This is where I see a lot of papers failing. You tell people what you did, and you don't spend any time trying to analyze the implications of what you did. So you've opened your paper talking about the research needs that the open gaps that you need to fill. And you have to conclude your paper by relating to that and explaining for a broad audience how your findings address these open gaps. So this is a structure that works in most cases. We don't have time to do exercises in a short presentation like this, but this is an exercise that I did with some of my students analyzing a paper. This is a great paper, very nicely written by SLAC, a free electron laser in Stanford, where they solved the structure of a single virus using the bright X-ray pulses from the source. So that you see there are these 4 main sections, and we go through the paper, and you can break down the main sections of the paper all down to the paragraph level, and you read them one after the other, and you see a very, very coherent structure emerging from this. So a very good exercise is to try to analyze 1 or 2 papers, try to write that outline. And when you write your next paper, try to have that outline in front of you as you're writing. It will guide your writing. It will help you sort of address that kind of vacuum and fear when you have a blank document that you need to fill in front of you. If you have a structure to build upon, they will help you a lot. And the outline is something that's changing as you're writing. Keep it on the side and keep revising it. And you may write, you may realize that it needs to be updated. But at the end of the paper, when it's almost final, reread your outline and make sure that this makes for a coherent structure. Paragraphs. So in this structure, the unit of composition is the paragraph. And this is a quote from the authors of Elements of Style. So each paragraph should tell full, independent, a little story, a little coherent story. And there are ways to give paragraphs a structure that makes them much more readable. And let me just give you two examples. There are two important options: a point first paragraph and a point last paragraph. This is an example of a point first paragraph. This is a paper from Liege. It's a discovery of the gravitational waves. It was actually written in an exceptional way. The paragraph starts with the basic features of GW. So that number is the event of gravitational waves. They dub it that way based on the date. Point to be produced by the coalescence of two black holes. So that first line tells you basically the content of the whole paragraph. And then they go on and they argument that statement. They use a lot of data, they present a lot of analysis, but if you give that line, you sort of imprint that into the mind of the reader so that they are able to digest what comes later without needing to make that conclusion themselves. So you guide them through the reading, you help them going through a lot of details while having a guiding logical point in their minds. In some cases, a point last paragraph may work better. This is the case when you're presenting a lot of data and then you summarize with a sentence what this data means. So this is another option. I'm not saying that every paragraph has to be written as a point first or as a point last. Point first, I would say, is the vast majority, maybe 70% of the paragraph that are nicely written are written that way. You have both options, and in some cases it doesn't work. It really depends on the content, but consider that possibility. Let me go through the last part. I had an example about an abstract, but I'm not sure I'm going to make it in time. We can get back to it if we have time. So you found your story, you built a story structure, and then you need to find the best language to tell your story. And so apply effective writing strategies, and we'll talk about some of them, that allow you to communicate that story with that structure. And I would like to point you to a really nicely presented paper. It's called Writing a Better Scientific Article. It's part of a style guide for review of modern physics. It's the highest impact journal that we publish at the APS. So the style guide tells you how to format a paper for that journal. So it's not really broadly interesting if you're not writing for that specific journal, but there is an appendix to that paper. You can find this online here. And that appendix, called Writing a Better Scientific Article, contains a lot of tips. And I will take some examples from there too, but there are many more there. I really encourage you to take a look and keep it on your desk. And when you're writing, try to see if anything that you're considering can be helped by some of the tips that the author is giving there. Effective writing strategies. Economy and lightness. The first point is, do not try to speak in a stuffy manner for a judgmental audience. As I was discussing before, when you are writing, do not think about your competitors and your supervisors only. Don't try to be complex. This is something that sometimes I realize I'm even doing it. We want to sound academic. We want to sound stuffy. We don't have to do this. There is no value in making it sound more complex than it is. If you can use everyday words that are still precise, you gotta use them. Economy is another point. The secret of good writing is to strip every sentence to its cleanest component. And I will discuss in the next slides some ideas on economy. But go through your paper and try to make it as short as possible. Try to make each sentence as short as possible. Analyze each single word. Is it needed? Does it really have to be there? Is there a long formulation that I could replace with a shorter formulation? I'll give you some examples in the following. So cutting unnecessary words. Giving you an example of one sentence that is completely useless in my view. This work sheds new light on the physics of strongly correlated systems. A sentence like this is typically encountered in the conclusions of a paper. So what does this sentence tell you? Think about it carefully. This work sheds new light, tells you something new. On what? On the physics of strongly correlated system. By the time we read the paper, we get to the conclusions, we know it's about the physics of strongly correlated system. So what this sentence is telling you is, oh, in this paper, we're telling you something new about this topic that we discussed that we were going to tackle. So this sentence doesn't add anything. If you want to add something, explain what is this new light, and try to articulate that sentence. But in itself, it's just a waste of words. Adverbs are often useless. If you think of it, many adverbs really, their meaning is implied in the verb or in the adjective that they modify, very, really, quite basically, generally. They are sometimes okay for emphasis. One editor at Nature once told me that she was automatically replacing every very that she encountered in a paper with bloody. So she would do that substitution and then go through the paper, and of course she would edit out any instance of bloody. And the result, she said, was the paper was just as good as it came. And think about other adverbs, like conclusively. We conclusively demonstrated that. If you demonstrated it, it's conclusive. If you didn't demonstrate it conclusively, it's not demonstrated. You've got to use another verb. So eliminate adverbs that are not needed. Jargon and technical words. I am looking at many papers these days that are dealing with this topic, how birds orient themselves in the magnetic field of Earth. And there are some quantum mechanical steps that might be involved. Many of these papers, they cannot say birds. It's too simple. They want to say the avian species. Why? Probably because it sounds more academic, it sounds stuffier, it sounds more complex, it sounds more scientific to them. Well, I think it's a mistake. If you can say birds, and there are many examples where people say something equivalent to avian species when they could say birds. If you can't say birds, say birds. There are no side effects in being simple, and there are no problems in using everyday words. And it's instead of 3 words, you're using 1. Paper is shorter, it's more readable. Another point, this is probably a little of a detail, but I'm going to present to you. I mean, active voicing is usually better. It's more engaging. And scientists tend to use passive voice a lot. They don't want that. They're not sort of selfish people. They don't want to be the center of attention. So this has been measured. This has been found instead of we found it, we measure. But passive voicings leave an open questions. Who did it? Is it you? Is it previous researchers? Active voicing is typically shorter. It's more compelling in general. So take it as a general. And if you go to that paper that I suggested, there are some examples where it clearly shows the advantages of using passive voicing. But this is not a general rule. You can use passive. I would say it's better to use more active than passive in general. Use short sentences. And this is something that I say people from my background do a lot. You want to show that you command English. You want to write complex, long sentences. In some languages, complex sentences are a sign of good writing. So take a look at this one. Techniques for direct phase modulations of laser diodes, typically based on the apply current, the voltage, and always associated with a very dramatic amplitude and frequency modulation of the emitted light, have been available for decades while being insufficiently reliable for high bit rate communication. So you can briefly when you read this sentence. And it's not just a matter of how nice it sounds. You really have a hard time logically retaining all the logical steps that are implied in this sentence. So it's not just aesthetics. It's really, accessibility and logical flow, and try to break it down when you see it's too long, and read this now. Techniques for modulating the phase of laser diodes have been available for decades. They're typically based on the control of applied current or voltage. However, because they are associated with a dramatic amplitude and or frequency modulation, they are unsuitable for bit-rate communications and quantum distribution application. So I imagine you feel it. It reads much more nicely, but it's also much easier to follow. It's much easier to retain the logical steps, cause-effects relationships involved in the sentences. And some other examples of clunky expressions that could be replaced by simpler ones. And if you go to the article that I was citing, there are many examples like this. So all this, long combinations of words can be substituted with something much shorter, and it's always an advantage for the quality of your writing. Another point that I'd like to make is visibility. Figures are very important. This is a clear example, the helical structure of DNA. And a lot of times people don't think about the figures of their papers. They are a very important part of your paper. And one suggestion I have is to build a paper around the figures. Or when the paper is ready, use the figures, just focus on the figures and try to present the work using the figures only in their caption. So read the caption one after the other. Is it enough to understand the story? And I can tell you, this is a way of reading a paper that a lot of editors, a lot of journalists, a lot of program managers follow. You just go through the figures and see if you can get the story. And one of the final points I want to make is multiplicity. As I told you, we don't have to think that our paper is only directed to our supervisor or competitor. It has to be broader than that. But you also have to talk to your supervisor, and you also have to talk to your competitor. So this concept of multiplicity is the idea that you can write your paper so that it addresses a broad spectrum of people, and different sections of your paper will be accessible to a different audience. The abstract, the introduction, can be understandable by every researcher. If you're writing a physical review letter paper, if you're writing a physical review X paper, every physicist should in principle be able to get the message. So that part of your paper should be accessible to all of them. And then as the paper goes on, you become more and more technical. And of course, there will be a core of the paper, which is, the details of the experiments, of the theory, that only experts will be able to really understand. So a good comparison is that of an hourglass. Your paper should have sort of an hourglass structure. It should start very broad. The introduction, the first paragraph should be accessible to everybody, and then it narrows down so that only experts can really get the details. But then very important is to broaden it up at the end. And as I told you already a couple of times, the conclusion part of your paper is something that has to be very accessible. So broaden your paper again and start talking when you finish your paper to a broader audience. So I'd like to sort of summarize, I think, the core values for writing a scientific research paper. And I like to follow a structure. This is a memo. This is an outline of some presentations that a famous Italian writer, his name was Italo Calvino, one of the greatest Italian writers that ever lived. He was going to go to Harvard to deliver a lecture for the Norton Lecture Series. It's an important series of lectures where thought leaders are presenting their views, not just writers, musicians like Herbie Hancock, the pianist, Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize for Literature, people like this presented there. So he was emphasizing 6 values for the next millennium, 6 values that the writer should have in their mind. And I think we can sort of revisit these values in light of writing a scientific paper. So let's go through them very quickly. Lightness. Your paper doesn't have to be stuffy and academic. It has to be as light as possible, as simple as possible. Say birds and not avian species if you can do it. Quickness. A economy is a core value of writing. The shorter, the better, always. That's an important principle in science. Occam's razor. If you have a complex theory that explains your data, you should go for it and not for a more complex one. The same applies to writing. The simplest possible writing that is precise is the one you should go for. Exactitude. Your paper has to be a flawless logical flow. You have to design it, use an outline. It has to be an algorithm that convinces your paper of your conclusions. And so logical exactitude is something very important. Visibility, think about the images, think about the visuals, work on them, make them simple, make them understandable, work on the captions, make sure that you read them one after the other, they tell a coherent story. And multiplicity, that hourglass concept, think about a multiplicity of audiences and make sure that your paper can be accessed at different levels, from the expert that will get something, but also to the broadest possible audience that is realistically going to read your paper. The final memo that Calvino wrote was going to be on consistency. Unfortunately, he died on his way to Harvard, and he didn't deliver the last lecture. We don't know what it was about. He didn't draft it. But this is my interpretation. Consistency. So if you accept your responsibility, if you accept that as a scientist, you are a professional writer, as a consequence, you will consistently think about your writing. As your career progresses, every instance of writing will be a little exercise that you can use to improve your writing, to improve your communication skills. And if you do that consistently, you will find your own voice. You will be able to control your writing so that your writing will reflect the clarity of your thinking. Your writing will communicate the passion that drives your science. You will find your own voice, you will recognize yourself in your papers, and will be a great asset for your research. So with this, I conclude, and thank you for being here, and open to any questions from your side. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Matteo. That was a wonderful overview on writing skills and communication in general. We will now get into our question and answer portion of our webinar, and we have a lot of questions that are coming in. So first, we have someone asking, as a young postdoc, how can one be selected to write a viewpoint? So in general, how do you choose authors for viewpoints?
Yeah, thank you. We're always happy to encourage young people to write. Of course, a viewpoint has to be written from somebody who has a sort of stature in their fields. So I would definitely say if you are a PhD student, probably this is not going to work. But if you are a postdoc and you already contributed to your field, I think we would definitely consider that. So to be selected, well, an important thing that we're considering is how people write their referee reports. So we want to see examples that you can communicate clearly. So when I'm sure you're probably working as a referees for the APS and for other journals. So when you do it, think about that. But we accept suggestions, and in particular, if you are the referee for specific papers, and if you think that paper is really a top papers in the field, feel free to write to us and say, oh, I just reviewed this paper, or write to the editors who are handling the paper and tell them, I'd be very happy to write a viewpoint. We don't always follow that suggestion, but they're always welcome. And another way to get in that business is if your supervisor is writing a viewpoint, to do it for hands with him or her. So that's another option. But definitely there is no age barrier. I think most of our authors are sort of tenure track level, but we add many postdocs. So it's definitely something that we encourage, and I think it's a very good experience. At least what most people say, it helps them also in view of writing high impact papers, not necessarily on writing commentaries.
Great, thank you. So we do have some questions related to the structure of writing a paper. So one question is, at what point during the research process should I start building a story or thinking towards writing a paper?
Well, I think so. The key question is whether you have a story to tell. So whether your data contain enough material. And so I would say the key aspect of writing is not sitting down and doing it. It is that brainstorming process. And so as you are doing your experiments, you have to think about that story. You have to think about that 1 or 2 line summaries that sort of gives the gist of what you've done. And you have to think whether that is clear or not. Is that emerging from the data or not yet? Do you need more experiments or not? So I think this is actually a process much longer than writing itself. But if you do it well, once you start it with that story in mind, everything will come easy. And so my suggestion is, if you have that approach of thinking about the story, and you can sort of practice that approach by reading a lot of papers, and for each paper that you read, think about the main story that they're telling you and write it down. And if you have that instinct, then you'll be able to sort of realize, oh, I've done enough data. There is a story behind the data already. I don't need to make 2,000 more experiments. I think the story can be pretty clear. So I had some exercises at the end, and one of them is write a 1 or 2 sentence summary that captures the story of 10 papers. I think this will help you sort of develop that instinct.
Great, thank you. The next question is a little bit more, again, this is about the structure of a paper. And this is, how would you go about choosing a title for a paper? And then another question is on what aspects should you focus on when writing an abstract of a paper? So the title and the abstract.
Okay. The title is a great question. I think, well, lightness should be a guiding principle. A lot of people write very long titles. One thing you should definitely avoid is titles that just tell people, you know, what kind of experiments you did, for instance, or what kind of theory you did. Say, density functional theory analysis of superconductivity in this cuprate. The title doesn't give you the message. It just tell people what you've done. So try to avoid that. And as a general message, you know, what we discuss in this talk, you have to present the story, not the data. So focus on titles that tell that story. So if you have that story down, that 1 or 2 sentence summary, it may be easier for you to come up with a title. And another thing, we talked about lightness. Titles don't really have to be that complicated. And I want to mention one title that always comes to mind to me. There's a paper called Diabolical Conical Intersection. And the original, it was published in a Review of Modern Physics. The original title was Breakup of the Born-Oppenheimer Approximation for so-and-so what potential energy surfaces. The longer title, of course, was a little more detailed, a little more accurate, but the new title, Diabolical Conical Intersection, is just so simple and so catchy. It gives the idea of the main message. These intersections are really hard to calculate. It's an important problem in chemistry. And with that sort of light feeling, that title is probably a good part of the fact that this paper was cited an enormous amount of time. And then the abstract, I had another exercise that we didn't have time to go through. But this was the exercise, and this is an example of a bad abstract. It's an abstract that just tells people what they've done. We have measured this. We've measured this spectra in this region, and these are the results. These are the numbers. If you analyze this abstract, the key problem is, why did they do this? There is no mentioning of what they were after. And then the implication, so what? You know, they measure these numbers. Are they big? Are they surprising? Or are they new? Are they different from what has been done before? What do they imply for future research? So try to address these questions in this abstract. This is another problem is that giving absolute numbers, these numbers that they measure, to a general rate, they don't tell anything. 2.3 plus minus 0.07, what is it? Is the error large or small? Is it better than what has been done before? And this is a very typical abstract, one that focuses on just what you did. So make sure that the abstract contains the other elements. We don't have time to go through this, but this is another abstract that does so. First, it talks about the context. What is the broad problem they're trying to solve? Then the needs, some more specific open needs, some knowledge gap that they're trying to address, how they address that gap and what they found, and finally the implications. So that kind of little structure, which is similar to the structure we discussed before, those 4 points, why, the specific need, what we did, and the implications. I think the abstract is a very important part of your paper. It's an executive part of your summary of your paper. Everybody will read it. So try to give these 4 messages, try to bring them across and think about it. Thank you for the question.
Great, thank you. Our next question is more about the writing process. And this one is about, this is actually something I think a lot of us run into. So this is a great question. In academic writing courses, we're usually told to never use I or we. So I guess how does this translate to scientific writing? So do you have any advice regarding active voice and passive voice? Because typically in writing courses, you're told not to use I or we, but
yeah,
the context is obviously different.
Sure. I think this choice is sort of personal. Some journals may even not like it, not like the first person. Very few, but some prefer an impersonal tone. I am definitely in favor of using it, and this is something that evolved through history. If you look at Einstein's papers, even before becoming Einstein, he was using the I. They were single author papers, and he was saying, I demonstrate that, say, the maximum speed is the speed of light. He was using that I. So we don't have to hide ourselves. And this is part of this general context of not trying to be academic, not trying to be stuffy, not trying to write in an impersonal way. In your writing, you can include some personal, some funny parts, some emotional parts, even, of course, with some care. But definitely, you don't have to hide yourself. So my general suggestion, if you want to use I in a single author paper or we, it's definitely welcome, and it's almost never a drawback. So I definitely suggest that you are authorized to do this, and it gives a much more personal tone to your paper. And it's in general much, using that implies the use of active voice, and it will lead to a more concise and better flowing paper.
All right, great. Well, it looks like we have reached an hour, and unfortunately, this is all the time we have today for the official webinar. We apologize if we did not get to your questions. We thank you, Matteo, for a wonderful talk, and we encourage you, our audience, to follow up by sending an email to webinars@aps.org, and we will forward your questions to Matteo for comment. A recording of the video will be made available on the webinar homepage and emailed to you. Please allow 5 business days to upload. Lastly, in order to help APS continue to develop quality webinar presentations, please help us by taking a moment to complete the short survey that we will send to you over the next few days. This wraps up today's event. Thank you once again, Matteo, for a wonderful talk, and we hope, everyone, that you will join us again next time. American Physical Society.
Thanks, everybody, for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.